Welcome, everybody, to episode 35 of Sports Shorts. I'm your host, Bobby Hacker, past president of the SLA, member of the board of directors of the Sports Lawyers Association, and I'm welcoming our guest today, Peter Schoenthal of Afliance. Did I say it right?
I'm about to send you a check. You're the only one that got it right, so thank you.
And we're going to have a little conversation today about the world of NIL, three of everybody's favorite letters of the last 2 years. And to start it off, as we normally do, Peter, I'd really like to just let us know a little about what Afliance does, what your role is there, and your path to this new and exciting and Wild West world of NIL.
Of course. And first of all, thank you for having me on. I know we just got back from the SLA conference and it was unreal. It was my first time there, and it was definitely worth the trip. Afliance is an NIL disclosure opportunity management software that also focuses in education. So when student athletes get opportunities, they can easily disclose their deals to their university to make sure that they are being compliant, not violating any trademarks, and also make sure they're not getting taken advantage of. We do license our software to universities. We work with about 35 schools nationwide. We also focus on education. We have over 90 videos in our library for all of our student athletes on financial literacy and tax literacy and life skills. What is a credit report? What is a credit score? What's a 401k? What's the 60-20-20 rule? Education is very important to me in this space because, for 100 years, we've been teaching kids financial literacy while they were broke. And now this is finally practical. We also realized very early on that student athletes weren't disclosing deals. So we figured out a way to have automatic disclosures. So we work with over 30 collectives nationwide, over 8 marketplaces that broker deals between athletes like Icon Source and Dreamfield. And we work with sports agencies across the country. So when student athletes get opportunities with their agent, with a collective or on a marketplace, that those terms automatically make it to the university without the student athlete having to do anything. My path is a little different. Football saved me. My dad was not around in my life when I was in high school. And if not for my high school football coaches, I would not have made it to college. I didn't play sports in college. I'm a 5'8" Jew. But my high school coaches kept me on the right path. So I went to Florida State University, going down a bad path again. And one day I reached out to my high school football coach and told him what I was doing. And after getting yelled at for an hour, he said, "You can talk to a wall. You should do what people that, can talk well do, which is go to law school." So I ended up at the University of Miami School of Law. My last year, I had a job lined up with the public defender's office in Miami. So I wanted to give back to my community. I didn't need an internship, and I coached youth football. I am the world's worst coach. On my team of 11 and 12-year-olds, 16 kids, we had kids end up at Miami, LSU, Alabama, Florida State, you name it, never won a championship. But when my kids started getting recruited, I didn't want them dealing with dirty street agents in South Florida, which is very common. So if we could drive, we would go. And so I would take kids on recruiting trips. We would talk about life lessons, really have these deep conversations. But when I'd go to the schools, I got very close with compliance officers because they didn't have to worry about me. The University of Miami actually got me cleared as a guardian for official visits. So fast forward, Florida, for no reason, announces that name, image, and likeness is starting July of 2021, I believe it was, or 2022. I even forget now. Whatever this 10 months ago was, I think it was 2021. Yep. And every kid that I coached said, "Coach Pete, can I make money?" And I said, "Not yet. You got about 2 years, 18 months." I think it was 2 years at the time. And my first thought was, as a criminal defense attorney now running my own law practice, how are these kids going to pay taxes? I do not want to represent them in federal court on tax evasion. So I got together with a buddy that owns a very successful tech development company, and we started brainstorming how we can help kids. And I said, let's reach out to those compliance officers. Let's see what they need. And so we met with about 3 compliance officers, and all 3 said the same thing. We need to know what our student athletes are doing before they do it to make sure we can protect them from eligibility issues and making sure they don't get taken advantage of. So right away, we added those individuals to our board. We started building the software. We started working with Kansas, Arizona, Georgetown, Boston College. They built the rest of it. And now we're at about 35 schools nationwide and growing. We've got Dan Marino on the advisory board, some really cool people. And if you would have told me 2 years ago that I would not be practicing law and I'd be running a software company, I'd tell you you're lying, but here we are.
So you brought up some really interesting points and some what I think are now really words of art in the NIL space. And let's break them down for a minute.
Please.
So you mentioned agents, collectives, marketplace, and compliance officers.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're all aware of the role that compliance officers have been thrust into in the last, year really, since this really kicked off, which is the people at the university who, to my mind's eye, are there to make sure that the athlete maintains his or her eligibility, which was probably the biggest landmine out there when suddenly it was announced, oh, you can make money on your name, image, and likeness. So
Yeah.
let's start talking about compliance officers and how you work with them.
Yeah, first and foremost, I think if you're not familiar with what a compliance officer is, think HR for an athletic department, right? That's kind of what their role is. And I feel terribly for them for a few reasons. One, for 100 years, their role was to always say no. And now they get this opportunity to really say yes most of the time. Most of the deals that we see, 99.9% of them are awesome. I know the media covers other areas and a lot of things going on, and understandably so. But this was supposed to be great for them, and it is a great thing. But the kids aren't telling them things. So they're left in the dark, which is leading them to be more conservative because they just don't know what's going on. And then at the same time, they're waiting for this NCAA guidance, and it doesn't come. And then you get 27 states with different bills and all these schools with different policies. So you're on an island because you can't call your buddy at the next school, or you can't go to the conference meeting and share notes because your rules might be different. Your approach might be different. And so you're dealing with people that are understaffed. More was thrown on their plate. They don't get to say yes. They don't get to have these communities and discuss. The rules are all over the place. A lot of them aren't lawyers, and they're being asked to decipher them. It's a tough role for them. We like to think we make their job easier by having a streamlined solution, by letting them stay in the know and making their lives easier on a day-to-day basis. But it is difficult.
So you have a compliance officer in one of the 27 states that have legislation. You look to the legislation, compliance officer is there to help make sure to administer it correctly, that nobody loses eligibility, the rules are followed. Now there's all those states that don't have legislation. Is that 100% on the compliance officer?
Yes, and unfortunately, it's even deeper than that, because even when you have a state bill, I think we've started to realize that the state bills don't matter a lot, because if I have a state bill in Florida and someone's doing something wrong, right? But we know in Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, all those schools are doing the same thing. Why am I going to punish my own, especially from the state legislature side, right? All we're doing is punishing our own state schools, our own boosters. And by the way, if I do that, good luck getting campaign dollars, right? So the state bills don't really do a whole lot, and they don't necessarily impact eligibility yet. Although the NCAA has said you have to follow your state bill. I mean, realistically, what we're dealing with, and I think what compliance is dealing with, is making sure there's no pay for play, making sure there's no inducement within the confines of the rule. There's a quid pro quo. You're not violating trademark issues. You're not violating university school policies and procedures. I think schools are more focused on what their school policy is rather than what the state policy is, and rightfully so.
And what about collectives? I mean, people hear that word a lot, but can you break it down for us a bit?
Yeah, collectives are basically a booster organization or a booster started organization that almost works as a marketplace. One of the issues with the national marketplaces, and what a marketplace is, and I'm sure we'll get there, is basically somewhere where businesses and athletes can broker deals, right? But what a booster collective does is it basically pools money and brokers those deals for athletes at a specific school. All right. So it could be in the form of appearances, supporting a local business, but boosters get together. Some of them also allow fans to give money. They pool money and they use that pool to broker NIL deals for student athletes at a specific school. 90 to 95% of them are doing it the right way. Unfortunately, we just hear the stories of the ones that aren't doing it the right way, and it is ruining the name of collectives, and it is causing issues not only for schools, but in the media.
So, which of course begs the question, if I'm a big school in a big conference with big boosters and we put together a huge package, our collective puts together millions and millions and millions of dollars. How does that integrate into the recruiting process?
Yeah,
And how does that work with the change in the transfer portal, especially in football and basketball?
yeah, that's a great point. And that's where the data is so important, because you have to be careful with what you say. All right. First of all, there needs to be a firewall between the school and the collective and the school and the marketplace, right? And that's what we create. I mean, essentially what we do is we work making sure the information gets to the school without them having to be a big player in it. When it comes to recruiting, what the NCAA actually did a few weeks ago was smart. So boosters and collectives should not be a part of the recruiting process. They shouldn't be speaking with recruits. Unfortunately, because they thought there were no rules, boosters were. I mean, we hear the stories of what happened at Tennessee with the Spire Group offering an $8 million deal over 4 years to a 5-star quarterback. We hear allegations and rumors about what John Ruiz is doing in Miami, although I don't have anything substantiated on him. All right. But if I'm a school, what you can do, if you know what your collective is doing, you can get the data from them. How much is in the pool? How much is the average deal? What were the freshman deals for the quarterbacks? What were the freshman deals for the running backs? So now when coaches go into living rooms, you can say, listen, we can't promise you anything, but we know we have a collective on campus. Here's what they did. Here's the data, right? Talk about fact specific stuff. And if you come to our university, and you have to trust that things will work out for you. And I know that's hard, a hard thing to swallow for a recruit, but recruits need to know that they have all the power. Because if you go to a school and they don't uphold their end of the bargain from treating you right standpoint, because now you know all the data, you can transfer and you can tell every recruit in the country, this school doesn't take care of our guys from an NIL standpoint. And now your school is dead in the water. So you don't have to do anything, because here's what you have to worry about if you're a coach or an agent, which we'll get to. Let's use John Ruiz as an example. Let's say he did something wrong. And let's say the NCAA punishes the University of Miami and says, you must disassociate from John Ruiz. He cannot be a booster anymore. He can't come on campus. He can't give money. John Ruiz can either take it on the chin, or he can file a lawsuit, which I think he would lose, by the way, based on Alston, weirdly enough. But if he files a lawsuit against the NCAA, we have a bunch of lawyers listening. Step one is the discovery process. And if there's an email or a text message from a coach saying, I need $100,000 for this recruit to come to our school, you're in trouble. So you have to know what you can do. You have to know how you can get outed. That's why we consult with these schools, right? Like, it's not just on the face of the deal. There's all these different layers to it, but there is a right way to do it. And so I know I went down a tangent about collectives and the recruiting process. Really what it is boosters and collectives, but specifically boosters, should not be in contact with recruits, people in the transfer portal, and people at other schools, which has been a rule for 100 years and makes sense. Leave that to the coaches, and just talking fact and talking data.
So those are the rules, but not everyone plays by the rules.
Oh, yeah.
And we've known for years, before NIL became legitimized, as it were, with my state, which was brilliant. California passes the first law, but says it doesn't go into effect for 2 years.
Yeah.
So the rest of you can get on the bandwagon and we'll just file amicus briefs, but good luck with it.
And then Florida's like, we'll take it from here. Yeah.
Right. Florida's like, oh, an hour? Here's the legislation. Let's go. But, historically, let's not play Pollyanna here. Yeah. Historically, we know that boosters were handing envelopes and doing stuff forever. People got caught. People got in trouble. Reggie Bush, big example. Heisman taken back. SC penalized. Things like that have been happening, I think, since the NCAA invented the word student athlete in the 30s to prevent what was going on there. But what are the teeth? What are the teeth? I mean, the athlete takes money. The athlete loses eligibility. What about that booster?
Agree. So a few things on that. We have to stop giving money to athletes in this new day and age NIL. That's not NIL. That's still the bag, right? We're just masquerading it as NIL. I mean, name, image, and likeness is defined as the 3 elements of the right of individuals to control the deployment of their identity, influence, and association commerce. I mean, it's the right to publicity. So just handing bags of cash is still handing bags of cash. I do like what the NCAA recently did, though, with their new rules, about the recruiting part because one, they also said they're not going to go after athletes. This is my problem with the NCAA always. When they were punishing people for all these years, right? They should never have been going after the athlete. They should have made boosters disassociate. They should have gone after schools and their pocketbooks, right? Don't go after scholarships and bowls. That impacts the kids. Find the schools, hit the boosters where it hurts, would say you can't associate with the school anymore, like they did with the SMU guys back, with all that. It sounds like, and nobody wants to say this, and I can't believe I'm saying it, it sounds like the NCAA, even if it's out of desperation, is seeing somewhat of a light on who to go after. Because if you look at their new legislation from a few weeks ago, they said, unless it's the most egregious of the egregious, we're not going to go after student athlete eligibility. We're going to go after those who mess up. But yeah, look, things are always going to happen in the shadows, right? The bagman's still going to exist. The problem is NIL is giving the bagman, everyone the ability to think that the bagman's okay. And instead of 5% of the illegal happening, it's like 95% of the chaos happening. And we need to get back, in any new world of legislation, there's always this, we're in the right period. You get a bill, right? It's usually vague. People push the envelope. They look for the loopholes. They look for ways to take advantage. Then the legislator narrowly defines the rule more, which is what happened a few weeks ago. Then you launch your investigations, which are happening now. You punish people, and then you get more of a uniform space. I think we're on our way. I just think the biggest issue is we're calling everything, and we're now calling paying athletes NIL, and it isn't. And it's
and not to interrupt you, but that's the message that I think has to be put out there, is that people think that now we can just pay athletes.
No, and listen, the NCAA has teeth. What the NCAA did a few weeks ago was, so there was always rules that said boosters cannot partake in the recruiting process. That's been clear, and no one would fight those as antitrust issues. I really don't think so. And we can go down an antitrust rabbit hole if we want. What the NCAA did was a few weeks ago is they basically further defined inducement, and they further defined a booster in the context of NIL, and they tied it back to recruiting rules that were in place for 100 years. Okay. So now they can retroactively go back, and if they find out that you in fact offered a kid an $8 million deal for the sole purpose of going to a school, which was already defined, right? They can now go after the school if they let that athlete on campus, okay? Or they can go after the booster by saying that booster has to disassociate. I do think the NCAA has teeth. I don't read Alston as if the NCAA is dead. I believe that there's antitrust issues, and I think it's why, a lot of these rules have to be looked at within the scope on how they limit student athletes. But I don't think you're going to get much of an argument when it comes to boosters trying to convince kids from one school to go to another school, or go speak to a 17-year-old and say, here's all this money to go to a school they don't even work for. I just think we're allowed to have reasonable rules, and I think those are reasonable.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point, because post Alston, the question I think all of us were asking is, how emasculated is the NCAA? And it took an antitrust language to sound big and bad, and it stopped legislation, and I'm sure you saw some of the proposals that they wanted to put out. Val Ackerman, I know, published one that was really good and really solid, but Alston kind of stops it. And then recently they come out with what they called, I think, recommendations a couple of weeks ago, and they were really solid, and they addressed a lot of what we've been talking about with, boosters' involvement pushing forward. But the teeth, do you think it's really got the teeth?
Yeah, I do. And I think there's investigations going on. And I think it's important to understand the timeline, right? November 2020, the NCAA puts out those proposed rules, which I think you're kind of referencing, and they were really straightforward. They were really good. Then Alston happens. Now, what Alston really stands for from the context of NIL is the NCAA is a governing body and allowed to be. Their mission is to put forth competitive, uniform rules for competitive balance, so long as the rules are reasonable. And by the way, there might be some antitrust issues. And then Kavanaugh comes in giving, his dicta that nobody signs, and does like what I call the Dave Chappelle skit, where he's at the table, smacks the water and runs. Where he's like, employment, boom, right? So then the NCAA gets scared. And they punt on their legislation. Well, what happens is on July 1st is you have 27 states enact bills, and you have over 1,000 schools enact policies, which basically copied the NCAA's original proposal because it was straightforward. Then signing day happens. Everything goes crazy. You have basically every athletic director in the country saying we need more rules. And I think that based on what the way those rules look like, that Val put forth and a few others, I don't really see a whole lot of antitrust issues in there. And I think you could argue that it's reasonable when every state legislature deemed them to be reasonable. Every school deemed them to be reasonable. And by the way, now everyone in the space is clamoring for some form of uniform policy with some form of teeth because of the way things are going. I would weirdly argue, and it pains me to say this, that the NCAA is in a better position than they've been in 3 years today, as it pertains to NIL. And that's not popular, I don't think, to say. And I also recognize that I'm rationalizing irrational people, which my mother taught me to never do, but here I am.
So do you think that, I don't think Congress can make laws that live in the moment, because by the time they get there, it's passed.
Yep.
Do you think federal legislation could help, or are we better just moving down the path we're on?
I think it could certainly help. It's just whether or not we can get it. And, it's interesting because everyone wants it. What's really weird is we started hearing a little more rumblings after National Signing Day that the government could get involved. They started taking meetings, and it's really funny how even lobbyists like college football, and all of a sudden, if your school's getting beat on the recruiting trail, you make a few calls, and all of a sudden you got some congressmen that are like, we should talk about this NIL thing. Let's bring the commissioners in. So I never say never when, the reason we also need the feds, and when we talk about D1 sports, it is a national issue. There isn't a single conference that has all of its members from one state. College athletics is a national pastime. It is a unique thing in the United States. And the athletes deserve a piece of the pie. We're going to get towards employment. That doesn't mean salaries necessarily, but employment and collective bargaining. They deserve a seat at the table. But we just need to be careful that we also don't get rid of college athletics as a whole in this country, because it's been such a great thing. And it'd be a real shame if we didn't have a plan in place, and we weren't ready to address what's coming. And that's my fear.
Yeah, look, I'm speaking as both a former, believe it or not, collegiate athlete and a big fan of college sports. I think it's critically important, nothing to do on the business side of things or anything else. It's part of an interdisciplinary education that a university ought to be supplying, so that you go and you get your education in the classroom, but whether it's being on the student newspaper, playing on a team, it's the other that enhances your development as a human being. And I think it's critically important to maintain that structure. Historically, you made a good point, is congressmen get involved. Why do they really get involved? Because those same boosters are supporting their campaign.
Oh, yeah.
And you want to keep the boosters happy, but there's no change. Like I said, in the 1930s, they were having this issue with boosters, paying athletes. And then that's when the NCAA started getting the first teeth, taking their first bite out of some of this stuff. So I think we've got a ways to go. But I think it's appropriate that these, I don't even like using the phrase student athletes, because I think it's been perverted in a lot of respects. But these kids, these students, the fact that, you look especially in the D1 sports, primarily in men's basketball and men's football, where they're making huge sums of money, and these kids are, being full-time students, I hope, and, spending, let's forget what the rules are. We know they're spending 50, 60 hours a week.
Yeah.
Sports.
No,
so it's right that they get a piece, and just the structure and the system is tough. It seems that what you guys are doing are trying to give them a way to actually have a path to make sure that it's being followed correctly.
Exactly. It's what we do, but also, the education part. You talked about like the interdiscipline aspect. The unfortunate part of NIL, and by the way, you made another great point. Like we're in the beginning of this. It's going to take 36 to 48 months to figure out, and that's okay. But as we figure it out and we get to a point where everyone starts to appreciate NIL for what it can be, it's the education part. NIL, think about it, for 100 years, we have been trying to teach financial literacy to a bunch of broke kids. All right. When I was in law school learning evidence, it made no sense to me. I had to go practice law to understand it. Well, if I'm making a couple $1,000 a month and we see it every day, we teach it. I don't care if you're a D1, D2, D3 kid, you can make $1,000 a month in NIL if you know what you're doing. All right. And you're a little creative and you put a little effort into it. All right. Well, now if you're making $1,000, $2,000 here and there, you might be more inclined to understand what the 60-20-20 rule is, to register an LLC, to know what a credit score is, right? Financial literacy is finally practical. And now you're taking that education and you're going into the real world. Another thing that NIL does a great job of is preparing athletes for employment, right? I mean, 99% of kids aren't going to go pro. Student athletes have these elite skill sets, which is the ability to work hard, work well with others, time management, overcome adversity, coachability, but they never had the quote unquote experience. Well, now if I can go to an interview and say that's not true, I've been running a business since the business of me. I've filed for an LLC. I've registered a trademark. I've filed my taxes. I've negotiated contracts. I've built my business. Now we're helping athletes sell themselves. Okay. And that's the whole beauty of college, and NIL can be used in that manner. And the last point on that is for the big stars, right? Because we always talk about college sports in the lens of D1 football, basketball, which is a really different animal. But if you have a kid that has 1 million followers and is a star on your campus, is going to be a first rounder, I would argue I'd rather them make the $100,000, $200,000 a year with NIL, which they can make their mistakes financially, then learn to live on that budget. So when they go to the NFL or NBA and they make millions of dollars, they don't make those same mistakes and blow through their money. They have some financial literacy education. They've lived on a shorter budget. I mean, there's beautiful stuff to this, but we're just not talking about it because we're dealing with, what the collectives are doing and a lot of these boosters are doing, but we'll get there.
When this was first coming about and people were talking about it, to my mind's eye, this was there going to be the D1 starting quarterback at a big SEC school making a lot of money because he's on TV a lot, he's known, he's a popular guy. How many of those top players in college football or college basketball are known to the general public? Relatively small set, and they're going to make money. But all of those offensive and defensive linemen, the fact that they can legitimately go out and say, hey, every Monday night I eat at this restaurant, and they get a legit free meal and some walking around money.
Yep.
That's the beauty of NIL to me.
Or they can go home in the summer where they might not be known on campus, but they can run a camp back home and engage their community, make a couple $100, and start preparing for like those type of things. You can give lessons now, in the off season. There's so much you can do. And again, that's the beauty.
What do you guys do? What do you guys do in terms of the financial literacy element, which to me is the most important teaching tool in this whole system?
Yeah, we offer over 90 videos on our platform on videos like what's a credit score, what's a 401k, what's the 60-20-20 rule, the importance of taxes, what's an LLC, what's a sole proprietorship. I mean, that's really my biggest thing. I wanted to make sure that athletes were equipped with that. So we focus heavily on that. We're adding videos all the time. We have a video coming out on what's cryptocurrency, what's Bitcoin, just to educate these athletes. The schools can assign the videos. You can monitor what they watch. But it was very important for me when we started this, having worked with athletes. It's not about giving them a fish, but can we teach them how to fish and use it within the context of NIL? And that's something that we provide every school that we work with.
Well, I could go on and on because this is such a fascinating area. And from the first deal, I mean, think about it was only a year ago that we suddenly, not even a year ago, when all of a sudden, I don't know, was it a gym guy said that every player on the University of Miami team was going to get $6,000 for their NIL rights. And I'm thinking to myself, I mean, if it walks like pay for play and it quacks like pay for play, it's pay for play. But that was the first one we heard about. And I'm sure there's been thousands of deals done in the last 10 months. And like you said, it's not even the tip of the iceberg. We think there's a tip of the iceberg. But I think from, our little conversation today, and my concern is most of these athletes, collegiate athletes, have spent their life from when they're little kids, working their way up, and they get to college. I don't care if it's D1, 2, or 3. and they play sports for those 4 years, 99.5% of them, they may play in a rec league, but that's the end of their career.
Yep.
So when you get that platform and you have 4 years, why oughtn't someone who's on TV every week have the opportunity? So theoretically, it's great. I just want to make sure these kids get their education, and the real education that they're getting is not only getting this academic education, but here's an opportunity to have real basic business lessons.
We're going to get there. Give it time. Again, we've been consistent 36 to 48 months. It's going to take us to figure out. We're going to get there. And I think this is going to be the greatest thing that ever happened to college athletics. And I'm excited.
Well, Peter, Afliance, staking a claim to teaching people the right way to do things. Great work. Thank you all for joining us. If you want to get more involved with the Sports Lawyers Association, please go to sportslaw.org, become a member, and it's never too early to plan your trip. Next May, we'll be back with our annual conference in Los Angeles. Be another great conference, but there's lots of stuff we do besides this show every other week, webinars, all kinds of other programs, our blog. Feel free to join, get involved. And if you want to be a guest on Sports Shorts, hit me up. Peter, thank you so much. Really appreciate the time. Good luck with what you're doing. And as a fan of college sports, thank you for doing it.
Thank you for having me, buddy.